You're listening to Mystic Lounge with Alan B. Smith. Rebroadcast on the Onyx Network. Thursdays at 11 p.m. Pacific. Fridays at 2 a.m. Eastern.
However you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Mystic Lounge. This is Alan B. Smith. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode. It has been a minute. I have a special guest with me tonight. Her name is Dr. Helané Wahbeh, and she is from IONS. And for those of you who are not familiar with IONS, it is the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And we've had past guests from IONS before because they get really smart people doing really interesting research in, I wouldn't even call it alternative research, really. And fringe, I feel like, is too offensive of a word. It's really forward-thinking science, particularly centered around consciousness. So tonight we'll be covering the gamut from healing, PTSD, meditation, channeling. Psychic phenomena does come up on this channel quite a bit. So of course we can't resist covering that territory. And Dr. Helané has just like so much experience and is so highly educated that I have to say, really pay close attention to the work that she's done that we'll be discussing tonight. So let's bring in our esteemed guest. If I can pull it up. Here we go. Hey, how are you? Welcome.
It is so wonderful to be here with you today. I appreciate those kind words that you are bringing me into.
Well, because I've read your resume.
Thank you. I feel
Yes.
blessed to be doing this incredible work and the experiences that have brought me to this point today, which is quite an amazing journey, I have to say.
Yeah, well, let me read your short bio for everyone out there now. So, Dr. Helané Wahbeh is the director of research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. She completed her undergraduate degree at University of California, Berkeley in anthropology and pre-medicine, and obtained her clinical doctorate at the National University of Natural Medicine. She obtained her Master's of Clinical Research from Oregon Health and Science University, where she has been on faculty in the Department of Neurology since 2006. She's also completed 2 postdoctoral research fellowships. Dr. Wahbeh is the author of the new book, The Science of Channeling, Why You Should Trust Your Intuition and the Force that connects us all. As a Star Wars fan, I appreciate your use of the word force. How do you feel about Star Wars? Well, let's start with that and that cultural phenomena.
Oh, geez. If you could walk with me through my house to my 11-year-old's room, you would see Star Wars paraphernalia everywhere. So I am definitely a big Star Wars fan and know quite a bit about it and all the different Lego manifestations of Star Wars.
Well, I admittedly I don't have Star Wars Legos, but it seems to me the Force is always with you where you are. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's actually beautiful because so many of the concepts that we see in media are reflections of, this concept that consciousness is non-local and fundamental and pervasive and connects us all. So I think it's really great when we see these reflections in movies, in various fiction around us that are kind of demonstrating that. I think it normalizes that for us in a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so. But we're still doing work, right? And that's what you're doing. So why is it so important to be doing the work that you're doing right now?
I think that there's many reasons. One is, we're kind of joking about Star Wars and the popular media. And I think in the general population, there is much more openness to these ideas that consciousness is fundamental, that there's something that connects us all, that we have superpowers, if you will, that we all have this innate ability to connect to the force, to perhaps read other people's minds or get mental impressions, to perhaps know the future, to have dreams where we get insight about what's going to happen.
And do you think that's real?
I believe that all humans have an innate capacity to access this information and energy from beyond time and space. And many of these phenomenon that exist on this huge spectrum, from all the way from intuition up to mediumship and trance channeling, they're quite varied, but many of those phenomenon actually have a growing body of evidence where we can demonstrate them in the laboratory, where they've been well documented, happening spontaneously. So it's not a black or white answer, but we can look at each one of those, and I can share with you kind of the body of literature that's out there that demonstrates that the phenomenon are real, that we can observe them.
Yeah, well, let's talk more about that in a little bit. I just want to see where you're at as far as your research in PTSD and recovery. Because I have experience in addiction recovery, not physical recovery or PTSD in the typical sense that we think of it. So where are you with that? What did you learn from your research?
Yeah, so most of my research around post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is in meditation research. So I was gratefully received a grant from the National Institute of Health to look at how mindfulness meditation works with combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. So we had about 100 combat vets with PTSD. They came in, they got randomized to one of 4 groups. One was mindfulness meditation. One was slow breathing. One was mindfulness plus slow breathing. And the 4th group was just sitting quietly. And so the goal of the study was, to see, hey, do PTSD symptoms improve, but also why and how do they improve? Because some might say, well, if I breathe more slowly, that's going to activate my rest and relax system, which might help improve PTSD. So what we found, which was quite amazing, is that all 4 groups had reductions in PTSD. So the meditation group actually didn't have statistically significant greater improvement than the sitting quietly or the slow breathing.
Well, can I ask you this? So my experience with meditation is that the reason most people don't do meditation, even though it could take 15 minutes of your time versus hours and hours of other things we do to distract ourselves, or go to church and all these other things, I think it's because those initial experiences with meditation could be extraordinarily frustrating and not peaceful at all, because your mind just kind of explodes and you're like, I can't calm it down. And that's why it is like an exercise. It takes a long time for some people, more than others, to get to that place of relaxation. Do you think that could be a factor in why? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's so many things to say about that. One is, it can be very difficult for someone with post-traumatic stress disorder to sit quietly.
Yeah.
And so, the goal was to have them do this 20-minute meditation. And yet, if they could not tolerate that, we said, hey, just start with 30 seconds. And when that feels okay, start with 1 minute and to keep going from there. The other kind of joking thing is, many people will go to a silent retreat where they go to meditate and they sit there and it's quiet around them, but their mind's going insane. And so there's no silence because the mind is actually very, very loud. And then there's this whole process of observing the mind to help clear that. I think so yes, you're right on with that. And, our attention, which we have control over, needs training. So a lot of meditation is about attention training, and it's just like working out at the gym. You just need to practice, be consistent, keep doing your reps. Each time you come back, you're like, oh, wow, I was able to kind of stay focused for a little bit longer there. My attention muscle is growing.
Right.
So that's one way to look at it. And then, the other thing about our study, which was so fascinating, is even though the results were similar across the 4 groups, we did some additional kind of interviewing, if you will, and found that the people in the meditation groups, their relationship to their symptoms changed quite dramatically. So they might get triggered and, have all these hyperarousal symptoms. And before, they used to feel guilty about it, beat themselves up, and kind of go in this downward spiral, which would make everything worse. So with the meditation training, they were able to observe it and say, oh, wow, I'm getting triggered. I'm still having these symptoms, but I'm not going to spin out into guilt and shame and frustration and depression, etc. So to me, that was a really powerful finding for this, 20-minute a day, very brief intervention. So that was a really exciting study that we did a number of years ago. And, there's a lot of other researchers that have looked at that with veterans and with PTSD. More recently, we've looked at lucid dreaming as a healing modality.
Yeah, I've spoken to Dr. Garrett Yunt about that.
Yes.
A little bit, yeah.
Yes. So he probably explained that we just finished a study where we found decreases in post-traumatic stress disorder from having lucid dreams. And specifically, the intention was to have a healing lucid dream where in some symbolic representation, the person would be able to face their fears and kind of move through whatever was the core of their PTSD. The results were pretty incredible, actually. Right. And we're still analyzing the result of a second study we finished to see if we saw similar results.
I'm not surprised because the subconscious mind is extraordinarily powerful, and we hear similar results from people who go to therapy, new therapies now, or 1960s Timothy Leary, but doing setting controlled therapy with psychedelics. And essentially the way people kind of describe those experiences is like they're able to look at the trauma, they're able to look at whatever that problem is and kind of dissolve it. It becomes less terrifying or less of a, you probably have a clinical term, but less of a big deal, and then it deflates it in a really interesting way. So that's interesting that there's a similar kind of process, but the lucid dreaming and psychedelic therapy.
Yeah. I think there's this connection to the nervous system and like resetting the nervous system somehow, so you talk to someone who has PTSD and they would love to not get triggered. Yeah. They would love to be able to sleep more easily, but it's like the nervous system is somehow stuck in this revved up state that they just can't get out of. And somehow the psychedelics, the lucid dreaming, the meditation is allowing that stuck switch to reset somehow. And, I'm a believer of there not being one right way, and that we have all these incredible transformative practices that are available to us. And it really is up to the individual to discern, well, which one really resonates with me? Which one aligns with me? Which one's going to be most supportive of me? And I think we're living in a very exciting time where we do have alternative options to just straight medication.
Right. How do we know when medication is really needed?
I think that really is on an individual basis. I couldn't really make any blanket statements about that. And I think it's also about a person's openness to trying different therapeutics. True. There's holotropic breath work, there's EMDR, there's emotional freedom technique, there's psychedelics now, which are, probably very close, if not some of them have been approved by the FDA.
For therapeutic use.
For therapeutic use, right. And lucid dreaming. So there just are so many options out there.
When you
so
were doing...
back to your original question, I really
Sure.
think it's an individual choice. And someone may find that they just are not able to cope day to day and they need help. And medications may be a bridge to help them be able to just cope with the day to day while they are exploring other options.
Right. Well, I think, I just remember hearing people doing that with Prozac. Like they start on a certain, milligrams, and then they kind of like lower it over time as they do go through therapy, and they can kind of wean off of it. It just kind of it like takes the worst of the anxiety or the depression that they're experiencing, so that they can actually take the time to work through the talk therapy. And
or even to come out of the cloud enough to be like, okay, I have that just a little bit of energy to be motivated to do that.
That makes sense. Right. It's kind of like, I guess, if someone's an addict while they're high, it's really not the best time to start doing therapy. It's not going to really work. But if when they have those more lucid moments of being out of that high, then that's when those decisions are usually made. Like, what, I got to do something. I have to make a decision, and that's where they have just a little bit of a moment of clarity to get through that.
Yeah.
Have you had experience with addiction therapy at all?
Not formally, no. Although I just heard a interesting story at a conference about Bill W., who was the founder of AA, and which, the 12-step programs are just incredibly powerful. And I know not everybody resonates with them, but they've helped many, many people in dealing with their addictions. And a fact that's not known by many people is that
I know where you're going.
Yeah. So have you shared this story with your audience before?
I haven't.
Maybe you can share it with them.
No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just recently learned that Bill W., after, doing AA and moving through that, started incorporating psychedelics into like a group therapy with the 12-step program, and was having such incredibly positive results. It was blowing him and the whole community away. And then they made it illegal, and it just kind of dissipated because they couldn't continue doing it. Maybe you have more insight into that than I do, but I found that quite fascinating.
Well, the efficacy was an important factor, and so before other people can incorporate that therapy into their program, there needed to be this like shared confidence that it's not a wayward leading therapy, because even though it can be therapeutic in a proper setting, under the guidance of a therapist or a doctor, if people were to take it recreationally, the effects could actually be disastrous for an addict, because it can stir up all kinds of things that you haven't yet dealt with psychologically, and then there's a kind of it is an altered state of mind. And the thing about using any kind of drug or alcohol is that any substance is that it is an altered state. So there's always that slight commonality there. So I think that my understanding too is a lot of people in the program were very resistant to it as well, and they did not want to bring that into their program because they're thinking, this works. Why do we want to risk that? And I totally respect that opinion. But yeah, it is interesting that it's never talked about, though.
Yeah.
It's never talked.
It makes sense. Well, maybe
right?
it is, because we're having this psychedelic renaissance, which is quite fascinating to me. And I'm absolutely convinced that psychedelics are incredible medicine when used wisely. And you brought this point up about taking them in, not the best context or without a kind of therapeutic support system to allow someone to integrate the experiences that you have. It can be quite dangerous and harmful. And, people can have be blasted open into these transcendent oneness experiences. And if they don't have the context and the support to be able to integrate that, it can actually cause harm. So I do think they're quite powerful and incredible medicines, but there has to be incredible care with which we apply them, and they aren't for everybody.
Yeah.
And that the different types act in different ways and may affect different people differently. So, I mean, there's just so much work that still needs to be done about who they work for, at what dosage, at what, once a week or once a month or once, and that's it. I mean, anyway, there's so many questions that are still out there about it.
When you were doing your study, the breathing study, were you doing breathing exercises like box breathing? Was it like simple, breathe in 4 times, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds? What was the technique that you were using?
We actually used a device called the Respirate, which is a device that's FDA approved to reduce blood pressure, interestingly, but it is just kind of walks people through slowing their breathing rate. It measures what their current rate is, and then it gently would bring their breathing rate down to a lower rate over the course of the 20 minutes. And then with the mindful slow breathing, we just invited the person to slow their breathing down, but didn't give any specific instructions about exactly how they should be breathing, besides being mindful of their breath and slowing their breath, paying attention to this process of breathing, the full inhalation, the full exhalation.
Well, that's interesting. This study kind of had this sort of disparity between meditation and just breathing technique, but some meditations are breathing techniques.
That's right.
It's a part of the actual meditation process.
That's right.
Yeah. So what do you for yourself? Do you do meditation? Do you do breathing exercises, walks in the park,
Yes, all of the above.
All the above.
My meditation, I have 2 kind of schools of meditation training. One is in the mindfulness school with, I'm trained as a mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher, and all the tools that are encompassed in that. And then I also did a teacher training with CoreLight, which is a group out of Santa Fe. And I've been working with them for, I guess, almost 21 years now. And that meditation is a mixture of focused attention and transcendent consciousness type meditation, where we work on our energetic body, getting our system into a relaxed, clear, grounded, and centered state, and then keeping our focused attention in the crave of Brahman or in our upper chakras, and as best we can holding that no thought state.
So do you believe chakras are real?
Personally, with my personal meditator channeler hat on, I sense them. I feel them in my body, in my energetic body. There has been very limited research evaluating them. Margaret Moga has been doing a little bit of work on it. We're also collaborating with some groups to try to be able to visualize the biofield, which I imagine is somehow connected to the chakras. But as far as I know, there really hasn't been any good formal Western science
Mm-hmm.
evaluating it and demonstrating them.
Why do you emphasize Western science? What's the difference?
Well, if you talk to a Vedic practitioner, they're like, we have thousands of years of science, which is the observation of the felt sense of the chakras. So it's I think very Western centric and arrogant to say that the way that we observe reality is the only way. And there are all these ancient traditions that have been observing, which is a form of science, through deep practices, these energetic sensations.
Are they just sensations because there are some, I don't know, pockets of energy in our bodies because of the way our nervous system is wired, and we're just, don't detect it? Or is it something that is related to what we, just call the soul or the spirit?
That's a great question. My understanding, from my limited readings on this, is that our physical body is a certain, layer, if you will, of our being. Our energetic body is an energetic matrix that includes our chakras and is related to our physical body and also connected to what you might call our spirit soul, but isn't our spirit soul. That our spirit soul is maybe one layer or a few layers beyond that.
So when we have instances of, dementia or brain damage, illnesses that can affect the nervous system and the brain, and, we see the degradation of one's recognized personality, how does that speak to this idea of having a soul? Because from the material perspective, it just looks like there's a brain. That's what makes us who we are, our personalities and all that. And then when things start going bad, so does the personality, because there is no substrate besides that.
So I love that question. So at IONS, we've been spending a lot of time talking about this idea that our consciousness is not limited by our brain. And the dominant paradigm right now is that who I am, who you are, this, conscious beingness of us is a product of our neurons in our brain. And that our brain creates it. When the brain isn't functioning or goes away, we go away also. And there's a various numbers of bodies of evidence that are demonstrating that our consciousness is actually not limited to our brain. And I can give you many different examples. There's a whole body of evidence from psychic experiences, right? So if I'm stuck in my brain, how could I possibly know what was happening to my cousin, across the country at the exact time that it was happening without, technology, etc.? How could an expert remote viewer get explicitly detailed, verifiable information about a distant location that they couldn't possibly have any awareness of? There was, even the whole Stargate military program that was funded and 500 actionable missions, etc., based on this idea of remote viewing. So that's just an example of this, of the psychic literature that I think demonstrates our consciousness is not stuck in our body. But you mentioned this whole thing about dementia, which I find quite fascinating because there's all these cases of terminal lucidity. Have you heard of those?
Terminal lucidity.
So envision, someone's in hospice, they're in very advanced dementia. You
Oh,
know,
yes, yes. Okay. Mhm.
yeah, they've had scans,
Mhm.
their brains completely atrophied, they haven't spoken for months, they're just basically a vegetable, right?
Yeah.
They're not in a coma, but they're not functional. Their brain function is not good.
Right.
And, you know, half hour before they pass,
Yeah.
all of a sudden they wake up,
Mhm.
hello, daughter, I love you, I'm so glad you're here with me, hello, son, hello, wife, having this incredibly complex conversation,
Right. Yeah.
coherent, etc. Their brain is still mush. Their brain didn't miraculously fix itself, and yet
Mhm.
they're able to have these clear, lucid conversations, and then they pass. How do you explain that? You can't I don't know
So
how to explain
yes,
that.
so I guess your argument is that the brain itself physically is so damaged that the mechanics shouldn't work. It shouldn't work to allow them to be so consciously lucid.
That's right.
And so what do the doctors say who are skeptical of this to say? Because I guess if from a layperson's standpoint, it would just be okay. Your brain suddenly, neurons started firing in a way they weren't, just because it's like almost like an adrenaline rush or some last minute attempt by the body to express itself.
Yes, I hear you. And that would make sense, but there's no um if you look at the scans and the labs and all that, there's no rational explanation for how that's actually happening.
Are there like EKGs, measurements and like brain activity measurements?
There have been a few cases that have been incredibly well documented.
Hmm.
There's been work done by Michael Naum and colleagues. They actually just recently published a paper. I can't remember in what journal, but that's probably the most recent kind of research review on the best cases of terminal lucidity.
So what do we see? Is it is there activity within the brain that looks normal according to the scans? I
Yeah, I
guess what
can't.
I'm wondering is if the brain is damaged, right? Like how can it? So okay, so there's activity. Is there more activity in the brain suddenly spiking when they have this terminal lucidity, or is it actually not really spiking? Because if it wasn't really spiking, that would be like extraordinary.
Right. It
Yeah.
would. I can't tell you that right now. I'm not
Okay.
sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll have to Google that later.
Yeah.
So in your research, actually, no, let me ask you this: in your practice of meditation and mindfulness, have you had moments of, and this is related to your book, of connecting to others, psychically, or kind of having a remote viewing moment?
Um, yes, I have. I can't really think of any specific examples in this moment. Um, my current daily kind of meditation slash channeling practice is more focused on supporting me as a human in my various roles. And
Hmm.
often it's about, okay, how can I be of greatest service? How can what is the next best step for me in this particular area personally? What is the next best step for me in my research world? Is it in my highest and best to go towards this research study or this research study? It really helps me ground on my inner wisdom
Hmm.
and guides decisions in my life. Now, have I been surprised by telepathic impressions just spontaneously? Yes,
Right.
that's definitely happened. I mean, numerous times my phone will ring, it'll be somewhere else, and I'll be like, oh, that's so-and-so. And then it's definitely them. Or, I'll have some connection with my kids or my husband. And we kind of just expect it, like not like we're trying to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising. It's just, oh, there's another, synchronicity.
Yeah. Do you think that ions and other scientists that do similar work can break through the skeptic barrier? And I don't mean just a healthy skeptic, but the skeptic who just refuses to really, really dig deep and look at all the data.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you break through that? Because there is a lot of really good evidence, some circumstantial and anecdotal, but there's also good, there is science to support these sort of, eighth sense abilities, right?
Yeah. I feel like times are changing quite a bit. Like when I started at OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University, people were not doing mindfulness meditation research. They were, it just wasn't a thing. And I was like, not fighting, but just like, okay, let's do this. Come on. I kept cheerleading, promoting, even within the Department of Neurology. I mean, it took years for me to be able to teach an MBSR class there, and I think it was like 5-6 years after I started, mindfulness was on the cover of Time magazine. And now, it's like in Fortune 500 executive boardrooms. And I mean, everybody's like, oh, mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like we're really on a very strong cusp right now around these ideas of consciousness, psychic abilities, with the psychedelic renaissance, which has such a strong intersection with psychic abilities. There's so many people that are really excited about consciousness and non-local consciousness that I see a tipping point that's happening. And we really are straddling these two paradigms, the materialist paradigm that's like all that exists is matter, and post-materialist that's like, no, that's not true. There's matter, but there's also a whole lot more. And there's just so many disciplines that are bringing forth results and research that are demonstrating that it's hard to ignore. And there's just more and more people that are doing it. But back to your original question, I think that skepticism occurs on a spectrum, and that, at IONS, we have the diehard believers, and they could care less about the science. They've had their direct experience. They're like, I know it's real. And there are cheerleaders, and then you have the diehard skeptics. I could talk to them till I was blue in the face about research, rigorous, multi-site meta-analyses, on and on about the data, but they won't change their mind because their worldview is static and they aren't willing to change it. I actually have love and compassion for them, but they are not my audience. Like, I have no interest in trying to change their mind. The audience is really the people in the middle who are open, who are curious, who are healthy skeptics, who are like, oh, that's interesting. Show me what you know.
Yeah.
And then I show them, oh, I'd like to experience that. Okay, let's create an experience for you. And then make up your own mind about what you personally believe. That's the person that I think IONS definitely aims to speak to, and probably your audience members here at Mystic Lounge as well. These open and curious people.
Yeah, getting the critical mass of people it's not going to be the people on the one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
But it's interesting that you're talking about how there's, and I've started really, if you go all the way back to like the beatnik generation, like you see this evolution of conscious thinking, spirituality, metaphysics, psychology. The evolution has been amazing. We find ourselves at a time where we're more divided as a society than ever before. And I know people say, well, that's a bit extreme, the Civil War. Okay, fine. But, if you go back decades, you did have Democrats and Republicans like socializing together, and you still have those exceptions today. They get married, right? But on a sociological communicative scale, it's poisonous, like it's never been before. And so if there's this upswelling of a desire for mindfulness, being spiritually healthy, why is this other contagion coexisting?
That's a great question. I don't know. I feel like there's worldviews and filters through which we view the world, So here I am. I'm at my home office. I have Zoom meetings all day. I work for an organization that believes we're all interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
We hold those values of love and compassion and honoring diversity dear, and we walk our talk. So in my reality, we're interconnected. I don't witness that divisiveness on such an intense way in my day-to-day. And my role in the world is to support this message of our interconnectedness and the implications of that. So if I am interconnected with you, then my actions affect you.
Mm-hmm.
My intention affects you. So I'm going to be impeccable with my word. I'm going to be very conscious about my projections. I'm going to, treat you with kindness because you are an aspect of myself. And that, ripples out from my sphere,
Yeah.
right? You look at media and it's a bleep show.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, is this real or is this manufactured? Because like today,
Mm-hmm.
the quality of our news from the external world is like a fire hydrant, and it is not does not value love and compassion and interconnectedness. And it's all about how you spin the story. So I'm not saying that the divisiveness you're talking about is not real.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think it is real. And yet I really wonder the percentages, because we aren't getting news about how of this upswelling of people's interest in spiritually transformative experiences, or this upswelling of interconnectedness or compassion. You don't get news stories about that. You just don't, right? So anyway, do you see what I'm trying to say?
I'm seeing what you're saying. And actually the interesting thing about especially, all kinds of media now, YouTube, big media, is a lot of it operates under the created perception or visage of compassion behind the reporting. And it's almost like a shield. So they report under this idea of, we're coming from a place of compassion, but it's not true. It's not true. They're using the right words, but the message is not sincere. And I think that's part of the problem too. But yes, it's definitely manufactured. But on social media, there's no doubt there's individuals on there that are not helping in the situation out at all. But let's talk about the channeling, because I haven't spoken about channeling in particular in a while on this show. So why don't you give us kind of a beginner's guide to what channeling actually is?
Sure. So that word brings up a lot of definitions for people. So I want to be clear that the way I use it is really a broad umbrella term to encompass everything that we've been talking about already, which is this, innate human capacity to access information and energy not limited by our conventional notions of time and space. And it can appear receptive like getting telepathic information, or it can be expressive, like directing my intention and affecting the physical world. So to me, that's this big umbrella term of channeling. What a lot of people think about when they hear the word channeling is what I'm calling trance channeling, which is this idea that the trance channel believes that their body is being used as a vehicle for a non-physical being to speak through them. So when you say channeling, what do you mean by that? When you say, I haven't talked about channeling on the show in a long time.
That's what I mean. Exactly.
The trance channeling?
Trance channeling.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I grew up with trance channeling. So you wouldn't know that from my bio. So I went to my...
You didn't include that in the bio?
I didn't include that in my bio. So I went to my first kind of spiritualist type seance at my grandparents' house when I was 10 years old.
Wow.
And there were about 40 people there sitting in a circle. And my uncle was trance channeling. And, you know, I knew him as my uncle, and he's speaking in this really bizarre voice and, you know, saying all these really profound things, even though he's like, was this, you know, troublemaker with tattoos all over his body and got into all this trouble growing up. And here he was, you know, professing all these incredible things. My grandmother was also a trance channeler. Later, my mother developed as a trance channeler. In the last few years, I learned how to do trance channeling. So I have a very deep kind of personal experience of it. And coming to Ions was the first time I could actually be out of the closet about it, and have been able to run a few studies on it, which is really nice.
So what did you find? Because it's not often people do studies on channeling.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we did one study with 5 trance channelers where we brought them all together in a home in Mount Shasta. And the goal was to do videotape each channeling session. We had a number of research questions that we would ask them when they were in a channeled state, and then we recorded all the information. We also had something called a random number generator, which was sitting in the corner of the room where we were doing the sessions. And I can explain about those results in a moment. But the results of the discussions were really quite fascinating, and being able to hear the different channeled answers. And, you know, probably the most profound experience for me was when all of the trance channelers were channeling at the same time, and their supposed channeled beings were having a conversation, a bit of an argument actually, with each other. And so that was an incredible experience. And then another amazing experience was when, you know, one of the channelers was speaking and saying, okay, now I'm going to go jump into that channel over there. And so the being supposedly jumped to the next channel and picked up right where they left off in the conversation. So that was really quite fascinating as well. So that's published. All the we analyzed all the content and came up with various themes, etc. But probably for the more objectively minded people, I think the most fascinating result of that study was the random number generators that we had in the corner. There were actually 16 of them on a little card. And what these devices did is they basically spit out random noise. And there's not really anything that should make it be non-random. You can think about it as generating an equal number of zeros and ones. So you should just end up with, you know, 50% zeros, 50% ones when you look at that data stream. So we compared the data from the sessions when we were channeling to situations where we're just chatting, not channeling, but just chatting amongst each other, but sitting in the same places in the same room. And what the data showed is that during the channeling sessions, there was increased coherence. So there was less randomness in the data when we were channeling. And it's kind of complex, but we looked at the data streams for each of those 16 random number generators. If we looked at the data stream of one individual one, it was less random over time. And if we looked at the relationship between each of those to each other, they were also less random. So you can think about it as it being more coherent over time and through space. So it's more coherent during the channeling sessions compared to non-channeling.
And by coherent, how do you use that term? Are you seeing more
less random?
So are you seeing like patches of ones and zeros in
yes, so it wasn't like an even
or?
match of
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And so what does that mean? What's happening?
To me, it was really exciting because I'm very sensitive. So if I walk into a room and people are channeling, I can like feel that in my body. So
it's so interesting. It's like because you grew up that way. you have like a sense, right?
Yeah. And so to have an objective measure that's able to just have some difference in the environment from these two settings is really quite profound. We did a number of physiological measures as well. We brought people in the lab and looked at brain waves and heart waves and skin conductance and voice analysis. Our first study found that the voice analysis was different from the channeling versus the non-channeling.
And how do you control the subject, the person? Because one can make the argument that, they're affecting their voice in some way or another purposely.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the limitations. And there's some people who believe that you can have a specific signature of your voice and that you can't fake that. But there's still a bit of work that needs to be done around that.
Is there a way to kind of measure the throat, the larynx, like the vocal cords, to see if there's a stress that is something forced, like when someone's forcing to fake an accent or something like that, versus just a relaxed state, and there's a variation coming through?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we did was a frequency analysis, which is affected by the tension in the vocal cords. So that would, I believe, come through.
Interesting.
Yeah, we didn't see differences in the brain waves, the kind of traditional EEG analysis, but we did complete something called a connectivity analysis, where we looked at how the brain was communicating with other parts of the brain. And we did see a difference in the channeling versus the non-channeling state in those studies, which is quite fascinating. The other thing I want to mention real quick, because I see we're running out of time, is we did this whole research program on something called the Noetic signature. I mentioned that, we're proposing that all humans have an innate ability to channel in some way, but that the way it shows up for them, their expression of it is quite unique. So we have something called the Noetic signature inventory, which is a 44-item questionnaire. And you can take that at nsi.noetic.org. And we have 12, through analyzing the data, we've found these 12 characteristics that show up for people about how they express this channeling ability. And one of them is feeling it in your body. So you know how when I mentioned about I feel it in the room, so that's really strong for me, but it may not be strong for you. You may have some other type of channeling expression that's not felt in the body. And it doesn't mean that mine is better than yours or yours is better than mine. It just shows up in a different way. And so this Noetic signature inventory supports people on this path of self-discovery of their own channeling expression and how it shows up for them.
That's awesome. And so it was nsi.noetic.org.
That's right.
Okay, I'll put that in the comments too. Great. So yeah, I mean, geez, I wish my parents would have, brought me up with trans channeling sessions. Who knows what abilities I'd have now? Yeah, I'll have to get used to that term, trans channeling. Is it important, the terminology, to you?
One of my greatest frustrations when I finally got into this field was like the number of terms that people use.
Mm-hmm.
They're just all over the place. Because you ask someone else, they'll say, no, that's called trans mediumship, not trans channeling. So that's why I think it's important to just say, well, what do you mean by that? Can you define how you're using that term?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's called trans channeling, trans mediumship. Often when people hear the word channeling by itself, they think of trans channeling. So that's why I just try to clarify exactly what I'm talking about.
Right. Dr. Helané Wahbeh, thank you so much for being on. If you could leave us with one thought, anything you want, what would it be?
I think it would go back to this idea of empowering ourselves to learn how to tap into our inner wisdom and to not try to take in that fire hydrant of external information only, to use our cognition, to use our intellect, and yet balance it with going within, tuning into our own insight and intuition about what is in our highest and best in every moment.
All right. Thank you. We'll leave it at that. Have a good night. I really appreciate your time. And everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. So stay away from the fire hydrants and focus on your inner fountain and your inner peace and mindfulness, however it works best for you. Thank you, everyone in chat. I appreciate your comments. And of course, if you are a fan of this channel, please like, comment down below, and subscribe. And don't forget to click the notification bell for future shows. Until next time, peace and love, everyone, and live in the mystery.